As we have already mentioned, piloting such a small spacecraft to land softly on the moon was also something unique for NASA and the would-be astronaut pilots. In order to provide some experience for this new activity, NASA built simulators on which the lunar module pilots could practice. They also designed and built a test lunar landing training vehicle, acronym LLTV, for use here on Earth so that the astronauts could learn how to control such an unusual, ungainly vehicle. It was controlled by a single gimbal-mounted throttleable rocket with a series of small side thrusters. Basically, the astronaut pilot was sitting on a bendable rocket. We will discuss this design and construction of the lunar module in detail during this video. Keeping the astronauts alive. Man had no familiarity with alien environments except perhaps under the sea. The moon has no atmosphere, only 1/6 of the gravitational pull of the Earth, and its surface bombarded by solar winds, hostile temperatures of up to 123 Celsius in direct sunlight, and -153 Celsius in the shade. Remember that 100 Celsius is the temperature at which you boil your breakfast egg, and your so-called deep freeze keeps your bacon fresh at -18 degrees Celsius. Astronauts would need to be protected against this searing heat, which would require sophisticated spacesuits capable of being internally cooled, as the heat on the moon is only by direct sunlight, ground conduction or ground radiation. There is no atmosphere to warm up. Then there is the monumental difference between the equilibrium temperature in the direct sunlight, and that is the shade. Notice I say equilibrium temperature. That is the temperature when everything has settled down over a period of time. The temperature does not suddenly change when you go from sunlight to shade, as many of our skeptics continually intimate. The astronauts would also need some form of heating as well as cooling during their vacation on the moon. As there is no atmosphere on the moon, the astronauts needed to carry their own portable atmosphere. On Earth, we live in an atmospheric pressure of 14.7 pounds per square inch psi at about sea level. The astronauts didn't require as much pressure, as most of our atmosphere here on Earth is nitrogen, which is not essential or usable to man, so they could only survive on only 5 psi if they breathed pure oxygen. In addition, the spacesuit needed to be strong enough to prevent accidental damage and flexible enough to allow free movement. One rip in the spacesuit, and the loss of pressurization could mean an unwelcome and sudden death in the near vacuum of the moon. In a vacuum, your body liquids would instantly start to boil or outgas, and you would become jellied in a matter of seconds, so it is essential to keep the spacesuits pressurized at all times. Added to this, the astronaut would also need to carry his own oxygen to breathe, water for his cooling system, and the odd battery to power everything. So a magnitude of complex problems had to be solved in the design of the astronaut's spacesuit. Now all of this astronaut survival gear had to be small enough to be carried around by the astronaut in a backpack and light enough to enable them to roll around on the moon and to carry out some scientific experiments. In fact, the backpack weighed as much as the astronauts themselves, about 180 pounds, but on the moon they only weighed about 1/6 of their Earth weight. We will take a more detailed look at the spacesuits and the backpack in this video. The Channel 4 Equinox documentary provides a good overview of what is involved in designing and building a spacesuit. The Moon Machine's video on spacesuit evolution is also worth a peek. We now have the gigantic spaceship to get the astronauts free of the Earth's embracing gravity, the onboard computer to guide them on their perilous journey to the moon, our astronauts fully dressed up for the occasion, and they are all ready to go. All that is required now is the living quarters for the astronauts on the moon. We will now take a look at what NASA designed to get the astronauts on that final landing on the moon and a safe return to the mothership, the lunar module. Fly me to the moon. The fleeting moon, no planet is of mine. William Shakespeare, Antony and Cleopatra. Gravity primer. Just a quick primer on gravity before you go wandering off on the moon. I think quite a few of you may be confused about this whole gravity thing. I raise this matter as I have been asked many times about this from those who I had imagined were the most educated people. I will ignore Albert Einstein's concept of curved space for the moment and treat it simply as a force as Newton did. Gravity is a simple force by which the planet or other body draws objects towards its center. The force of gravity keeps all of the planets in orbit around the Sun, and it keeps the Moon closely coupled with the Earth. It also keeps you firmly rooted on the floor. Isaac Newton showed this, that it is a function of the product of two masses, that is, weight, and that of the force diminishes by the square of the distance between the two objects, so the farther apart the two objects are, the less the interactional forces. We also have gravity here on Earth, as you observe when you drop something, or in my case, fall over. It is useful as it keeps you, like all things around you, firmly stuck to the Earth. Likewise, we have gravity on the Moon, albeit less than Earth's gravity, due to the Moon's smaller size. So you might just be wondering why the astronauts on the old space shuttle, or now in the International Space Station, are floating around in zero gravity. Does gravity stop outside the Earth's atmosphere, then start again at the Moon? So why do the astronauts appear to be weightless? Well, they are not. What I hear you say is that you see it all the time on TV, weightless astronauts performing crazy tricks with weightless objects. Trust me, they are just as much as subject to Earth's gravity as you or I. In fact, they are in constant freefall towards the Earth, pulled in by Earth's gravity. What you are witnessing is continually falling men, not weightlessness. This happens because of the speed and the orbit trajectory of the spacecraft. It is constantly falling towards the Earth, but missing it as it continually falls over the edge. Since writing the material for this video, I have found a very good video by Walid Shahabi in which he explains what is happening to the astronauts and the spacecraft. It is the same effect that they experience in the Vomit Comet, which is a part of NASA's reduced weight research program started in 1959, in which an aircraft climbs and then dives in a parabolic arc, which is equivalent to falling out of the sky. Luckily, the pilot knows exactly how to pull out of this parabolic dive. Liftoff for the Moon. At liftoff, the Saturn V rocket, the lunar module LM, was coupled together with a command module CM and remained as coupled together until the spacecraft was clear of Earth. The lunar module was then released, the command module then pinuated and relinked with the other end of the lunar module, so the two moon-going astronauts could transfer from the CM to the LM when they reached the Moon. When the astronauts were safely inside the LM, the two craft would then be undocked and the LM headed towards the Moon's surface. While the astronauts were on the Moon, the CM would stay in orbit with the command module pilot. There is an informative document on the command module in the Moon Machine's video. Lunar Module. The lunar module was the space vehicle used to actually perform the tricky landing on the Moon. It was designed and built by Northrop Grumman according to detailed NASA specifications. It consisted of two separate stages, closely coupled together. At the bottom is the descent stage and above is the ascent stage. The combined weight of these two spacecraft was 32,400 pounds. The descent stage, weighing 21,900 pounds, with its maximum 10,500 pound force thrust throttleable engine on a gimbal, was the method of providing a power descent to slow the craft down to accomplish a soft, safe landing on the Moon. The important new developments with this rocket descent engine is that it had a throttle necessary to adjust the amount of thrust similar to an accelerator in your car and a gimbal by which the rocket motor could be angled. The throttle was indispensable to reduce the thrust as the lunar module slowly approached the Moon's surface. It was the ability of the astronaut pilot, assisted by the onboard computer, to skillfully adjust the throttle and the gimbal angle of the rocket to ensure a successful upright landing. The ascent stage, weighing 10,500 pounds, was used for the final takeoff from the Moon. It had a fixed 3,500 pound forced fixed thrust engine with an array of side thrusters for latitudinal movement. The system had a difficult berth, which was plagued with many problems during its design and development, so much so that it overran its development program and consequently missed its inaugural test flight on Apollo 4, so that its first flight into space was rescheduled and it finally flew on Apollo 5. I will just digress a little and explain what is meant by the thrust of a rocket engine, so pay attention and listen carefully. Aspirins will be passed around later for those in desperate need, and there will be revision questions at the end, so concentrate. Rocket thrust and weight. A pound of thrust is the amount of thrust it would take to keep a 1-pound object stationary against the force of gravity here on Earth. So to move anything upwards against Earth's gravity then, the amount of thrust must be greater than the weight of the object to be moved. So far, so good, I hope. This is why the Saturn V assembled rocket, weighing 6.2 million pounds, required 7.5 million pounds of thrust to get it moving against Earth's gravity, as the fuel is consumed at a rate of 30,000 pounds per second on takeoff, and then the weight quickly reduces and the liftoff gets easier. The gravitational pull of the Earth also gets marginally less, and as a consequence, the required thrust gets less. In my limited logic, then it follows that the thrust required on the Moon for the same mass must be less due to its lesser gravitational force. I have been unable to determine whether the thrust figures given by NASA for the descent and ascent engines are Earth or Moon measures. However, given that the ascent stage weighed in at 10,500 pounds, then the ascent stage engine with only 3,500 pounds thrust would not be able to budge on Earth, so I confidently assumed that it must logically be a Moon measurement. The total weight of the module was a major constraint for Northrop Grumman, the company that was contracted to develop the system for NASA. Every pound of lunar module weight would require 4 pounds of fuel at Earth takeoff. Therefore, every ounce that could be saved was saved, including not providing seats for the astronauts who were obliged to stand. They also tipped the lunar module upside down and gave it a shake to dislodge any stray nuts and bolts inadvertently left during construction. When you look at the lunar lander, you have to wonder whether it was really designed by an engineer at the forefront of precision technology, or simply fashioned by a group of overexcited children just before the long-awaited school play, as some skeptics have mockingly insinuated. The truth is, say NASA, that it didn't need to be streamlined, as there is no atmosphere on the Moon, and it didn't need to be fancy-looking, as it was assured there was no spectators on the Moon to give mordacious comments as it landed. The skeptics have had great fun mocking the flimsy-looking design of the lunar module with its gold-quality street wrapping paper and the seemingly excessive use of gaffer tape, but more on that hilarity later. Type of fuel used. Both the descent and ascent engines were hypergolic fuel. This consists of two components, the fuel itself and an oxidizer. When these two components are brought together in contact with each other in the rocket engine, they spontaneously ignite. Strangely enough, that reminds me of my ex-wife. If you want to know more about the hypergolic fuel, or just want to see what a real university professor should look like, then watch this video above. NASA provides a detailed overview of the lunar module propulsion system. The advantage of the hypergolic fuel is that no igniter is required. I can imagine the astronauts using their very last match, trying in vain to ignite the rocket in fear of being marooned on the Moon. The problem with the hypergolic fuel is that it was found to be excessively corrosive, and after each test of the engine, they had to be completely rebuilt. Now think about that for a moment. None of the engines used on the Apollo descent or ascent stages could therefore have been tested prior to use. Imperfection was not an option. They had to be perfect. This could be viewed as a major design flaw in an already dangerous endeavor. Clearly, the astronauts had considerable faith in the mechanics back at NASA. I need to introduce them to Reliable Denny, my erstwhile garage mechanic. Another, not to be overlooked property of hypergolic fuel is its total inability. It boils at 38 C and freezes at -1 C. As we will discuss later in this video, the air that I breathe, the climate on the Moon can vary between 123 Celsius in the direct sunlight and -153 Celsius in the shade, so keeping the fuel safe was a major challenge required by serious insulation, as did the whole lunar lander. According to NASA, that is what the fetchingly gold-colored quality street paper is all about. In fact, it is sophisticated insulation material called mylar. Test aircraft. The major issues in the design of the actual lunar lander were those of control for the landing and propulsion for the eventual takeoff. Naturally, no one has ever piloted such a vehicle in space, so some form of testing was in essence. NASA contracted Bell Aerospace to create the bizarre-looking vehicle, which was affectionately and quite accurately referred to as the Flying Bedstead. In order to better simulate the 1/6 gravity that would be experienced on the Moon, it had a gimbal-mounted vertical jet engine to counter the 5/6 of its weight and therefore simulate the effects of the lesser gravity on the Moon. The astronaut pilot controlled a separate throttleable rocket with a controllable gimbal which allowed the descent engine to be tilted by up to 6%. In addition, it had small side thrusters for attitudinal control. It was a most ungainly and unstable vehicle, which the test pilots found extremely difficult to master. There is a famous video of Neil Armstrong escaping almost certain death as he ejected seconds before it crashed into the ground in a ball of flames. As one may imagine, this video is often referred to by the skeptics as one good reason why it would not work on the moon, but more of that later. In total, 5 of these unusual aircraft were built, of which 3 were destroyed in near-fatal accidents, one on 6th of May 1968 with Neil Armstrong as pilot, one on 8th December 1968 with Joe S. L. Grantee as pilot, and one on 29th January 1971 with Stuart M. Present as pilot. Luckily, they had the luxury of ejector seats, so they survived. An ejector seat on the moon would not help as there is no air for the parachute, and landing safely on the moon with no ride home is in any case totally pointless. The flying bedstead proved exceedingly dangerous to fly as witnessed by the crashes. Sensibly, it was equipped with a rocket-powered ejection seat, so in each accident the pilot managed to survive mercifully intact, although no doubt considerably shocked. NASA soon considered it to be too dangerous for testing, and all subsequent tests were carried out in a safer, purpose-built, ground-based simulator. Lunar Module Simulator. We now know flight simulators quite well, as very sophisticated software-controlled machines providing quite realistic environments very close to actuality. But we are back in the 1960s when computers were still in their infancy and not much more advanced than simple calculators, although NASA describes it as being high-tech, which I suppose it was for the time. The Lunar Lander Simulator was an optimistic attempt to provide some experience of what it might be like to control an actual spacecraft as it approached the moon's surface in powered descent. It was not so much computerized, but more mechanical, utilizing extreme large models of the moon's surface, cameras, and a rudimentary seating arrangement for the pilot. Even the simulator provided to be a problem to control, and the pilots had great difficulty in learning to master this unfamiliar method of flight. The astronaut pilot seated in the simulator would have seen the cratered lunar surface track past him on a revolving conveyor belt, which was supposed to accustom him to the visual cues of a pilot would see upon arrival on the moon. The use of simulators was, rather hastily, discontinued soon after Neil Armstrong planted the American flag on the moon. According to NASA, this was because landing on the moon provided to be surprisingly problem-free. One would have thought that the simulator could be credited for being some assistance to Neil Armstrong prior to the event, but it would have likewise been of similar assistance to following astronaut pilots, but NASA mysteriously considered otherwise. The construction of the lunar module. There are many aspects of the lunar module which now have attracted criticism from some skeptics, which we will now examine. In particular, the shoddy-looking appearance does not engender confidence in its abilities. It was supposedly a well-engineered precision piece of space technology upon which the lives of the astronauts would depend. The lunar module used an altimeter radar to report its height above the lunar surface as it descended towards the moon. Below each of the footpads hung a 1.5-meter probe that illuminated a light in the cabin when the probes touched the lunar surface, and the astronauts can then immediately stop the engine to avoid the engine nozzle from hitting the ground and the lander bouncing back up again like children on a bouncy castle. Lunar module power supply using batteries. Once the lunar module had landed, the descent stage was of no consequence as it had been virtually exhausted of all of its fuel. The ascent stage was more of a problem as it was full of fuel ready for the ascent, and equally as important, it was the only safe refuge for the astronauts in the hostile environment of the moon. It was therefore necessary to keep it cool using an active cooling system, a coolant loop with a heat exchanger and an evaporator. It also needed to be repressurized when the astronauts returned from their walkabouts on the moon's surface. All of these systems were powered by onboard batteries. Most astonishingly, NASA states that due to the complexity and development costs and the time constraints, off-the-shelf battery technology was used, and this is in a $25 billion project. Having recently had a spat of flat battery problems with my car, I found this rather surprisingly lucky I was not on the moon. One has to bear in mind that these were batteries using 1960s technology. These days, battery power and all of its associated technology is a complex technical subject. The skeptics question whether the lunar lander had sufficient power to keep all of the systems running while it was on the moon's surface. Unlike the command module, the lunar lander did not carry any fuel cells, so was totally reliant on battery power. In brief, the fuel cells burn oxygen and hydrogen in the presence of some form of catalyst to produce electrical energy and useful water as a byproduct. Just a few words before we examine this question. You may be familiar with your electricity bill, which will normally charge you for the number of watt-hours you have consumed. Typically, it will show your bill as kilowatt-hours. 1 kilowatt is 1,000 watts. Batteries may be rated in either watt-hours or amp-hours. The difference between the two measurements is a technical one and depends on the voltage. The number of watts is simply calculated as the product of the amps times the volts. Don't worry if you are mystified, it is not relevant that we fully understand the finer details of electrical power. But to put it simply, watt-hour states that a battery can supply the amount of watts for 1 hour. So, for example, a 60 watt-hour battery could power a 60-watt light bulb for 1 hour before being drained and everything being plunged into darkness. The other factor is the voltage, which was 29 volts for all batteries on the lunar module. The descent stage batteries were rated at 400 amp-hours and the ascent stage batteries at 296 amp-hours. In total, the descent stage carried 4 batteries. After the Apollo 13 incident, an additional battery was added, and the ascent stage carried 2 batteries. NASA say that whilst on the lunar surface, only the descent stage batteries were used for power in the lunar lander. This means that the total power for the lunar lander was 1,600 amp-hours, 4 batteries times 400 amp-hours. This means that the batteries could supply 1,600 amps for 1 hour before being totally discharged. The voltage was 29 volts, so the total number of watt-hours was 46,400, that is 29 volts times 1,600 amps. Apollo 11 stayed on the moon's surface for just 22 hours, so they had, assumingly and probably unrealistic average, 2,109 watt-hours of power per hour, or enough power to power 21 100-watt light bulbs for the duration of their stay. Sounds like party time to me. In later missions, with the extra battery in the descent stage, they had 2,000 amp-hours, that is, 5 batteries times 400 amp-hours, which is 58,000 watt-hours, that is, 29 volts times 2,000 amps. In Apollo 16, they stayed on the lunar surface for 75 hours, so they had just over 773 watt-hours, not quite enough power to power 8 100-watt light bulbs for the duration of their stay. The skeptics point out that this appears to be manifestly insufficient. The believers, however, contend that this was sufficient power to survive the number of hours of lunar stay for each of the Apollo missions and keep all of the relevant systems powered up. I have been unable to determine the actual power requirements for each individual system in the lunar lander, and without knowing this, there is not much possibility of it being conclusive. As a simple comparison, my car battery is rated at 840 watt-hours, so the Apollo 16 mission survived on a battery less powerful than my car battery, and remember NASA, to save costs, did use normal vehicle batteries with 1960s technology. On the positive side, I do have the benefit of roadside assistance if anything goes wrong. For those eager electricians among us who cannot wait to dissect every detail, you can see the full battery specifications in the NASA document. Lunar module dimensions. Another relevant point discussed by several skeptics is the size of the lunar module and the amount of space inside for the 2 astronauts and their associated clobber. NASA shows this to be a total of 235 cubic feet with dimensions of approximately 7'8" by 3'6" by 8'9", an exceedingly small space for 2 astronauts and their bulky spacesuit and their change of clothes. In fact, the habitable volume according to NASA was only 160 cubic feet. Look around you and imagine the size. It is rather diminishingly small. In this confined area, the 2 astronauts descended to the moon and spent 2 days there, either standing or at night sleeping in hammocks. Yes, hammocks. Each time they did an extravehicular activity, EVA, the astronauts needed to don on their bulky spacesuits and backpacks in this confined space. You may have seen videos of the astronauts being prepared in their spacesuits here on Earth, which all demonstrate that you need a great deal of assistance to get them on. This is one of the areas of the moon landings which skeptics have been keen to highlight. Given that we see the above NASA videos, the skeptics ask, is it really feasible for the two astronauts could have put the spacesuits on themselves in such a confined space without outside help? The spacesuits used on the Apollo missions weighed together with the backpack 180 pounds, which of those of you paying proper attention is only equivalent to 30 pounds on the moon due to the 1/6 of gravity. Even so, needing to perform this difficult task in such a confined space is not the easiest way to get dressed. Even donning on the helmet and gloves and ensuring a proper seal appears to require assistance, as can be seen in these NASA videos. One must conclude that these astronauts needed the other in some way. I have been unable to find any NASA videos of the astronauts performing this task in their environment on the lunar lander capsule. Simply out of morbid curiosity and a desire to somewhat be more scientific, I persuaded my relevant neighbor to partake in a little experiment in my garden shed. He, like myself, is approximately spaceman-sized. We removed the old bikes, lawnmowers, and all the other yearly accumulated debris and inserted an old sheet of plywood to reduce the shed dimensions and to approximately the size of the capsule. Of course, we didn't have spacesuits, but we took our camping backpacks and extra bulky coats to don. I can testify that with the flailing arms, attempting to balance on one leg, the summer heat, and the occasional issuing of unmentionable profanities, it is certainly not the easiest maneuvers. I do not pretend that it was in this way a flawless scientific experiment, but it did portray a sense of the problem and brought me intimately closer with my neighbor, which I would not normally have wished. In this detailed investigation of the Apollo moon landings, the skeptic James Collier says something about his research into the size of the moon lander and particularly the dimensions of the exit door. He examines the depth of the astronauts' backpacks and contends that the lunar module exit door is not sufficiently large at 32 inches for the astronauts to pass through wearing their backpacks. Although the exit door is 32 inches square, but because the door opens inward, the width is further reduced by about 3 inches. Collier estimates that the depth of the backpacks plus the astronaut is also about 32 inches, so it would have been an exceedingly tight fit. The astronauts had to exit the lunar lander backwards on their stomachs and enter the same way as shown in the NASA photographs. You can clearly see from this photograph how much of a tight fit it really was for the astronauts. One would imagine that there was a clear and present danger that could have damaged something on the spacesuit or on the lunar module. NASA provided an overview of the lunar module in this description above. Another skeptic in Australia, going by the charming handle of a jungle surfer, has produced a series of videos also about the limited dimensions of the lunar lander, I must say with a very Aussie-type presentation. In the first video, he examines the amount of cargo that needed to be fitted into the space-limited lunar lander, and in the second video, he discusses 3 astronauts living and surviving for a week in the tiny re-entry capsule. Not for the faint-hearted. Lunar rover. If you are bound for the moon and you want to see some of the sights, then what better way than to take your own car? The first time the lunar rover was included on a mission was on Apollo 15 in 1971, and then subsequently on Apollo 16 and 17. A detailed description of the lunar rover is given on the astronaut's website and also on the moon machine video. Naturally, the lunar rover needed to be transported all the way to the moon on board the lunar lander. The vehicle could carry 2 men, but was too large to fit inside of the lunar lander, so NASA designed a fold-up version that could be unpacked when the lunar lander was safely on the moon's surface. The design of the folding lunar rover was ingenious as shown in this NASA animation. NASA also produced a handbook for the lunar rover. This fold-up version was carried in one of the cargo bays between the legs of the lunar lander and was unloaded by the astronauts when on the moon on Apollo 15. You actually get to see the astronauts unpack the lunar rover in this video of Apollo 15. Seems it was not such an easy task after all. The lunar rover also carried 2 cameras and both audio and visual transmitters to send the television signals back to mission control on Earth. The lunar rover cameras could even be controlled by mission control from here on the Earth, albeit with a delay of about 3.2 seconds in the control loop, but nevertheless they managed to video the blastoff of the lunar lander from the moon. Our skeptics have other comments to make on the lunar lander. Again, a closer look at the lunar lander reveals some extraordinary surprises. Hunchbacked draws our attention to the US flag decal attached on the lunar lander. Although it is hard to comprehend that on such an expensive project, this decal appears to be attached with sellotape, and Hunchbacked also notes a difference in the fold of this plate between the two photographs taken on the same mission. When I first saw this photograph, AS17-134-20470, I could not believe it, so I went to look in the NASA image archive to be sure it was a genuine NASA photograph, and it is. There are even more clear photographs of this strange US flag decal, for example, AS17-134-20480. Here we have a US $25 billion project, and the US flag decal appears to be made of some flimsy material like cardboard and is affixed with sellotape. How could this be? There are just two possibilities. Either the decal was attached there on Earth before the spacecraft departed, or it was fixed on later by the astronauts after they had landed on the Moon. The first possibility appears to be highly unlikely, that the vehicle traveled 240,000 miles to the Moon and the sellotape did not become dislodged. The second possibility seems just as unlikely, that the astronauts carried the decal in their spacecraft and attached it themselves after they arrived on the Moon. Try to imagine the astronaut being able to manipulate a roll of sellotape wearing what, in effect, amounts to a pair of gardening gloves. I myself had many titanic struggles with rolls of sellotape. Intrigued to know if the US flag decal was attached to the lunar module before it left Earth, I investigated further and found a photograph of the Apollo 16 lunar module just after it had separated from the command module before it descended to the Moon. It is clear on this photograph that the US flag decal is already attached to the module. It is hard to comprehend that NASA engineers would have stuck this decal in such an amateurish way with sellotape, but apparently they did. I have not found any comments on this forum from the believers. The spacesuits also come in for some comments from the skeptics. The spacesuits, as we will recall, are inflated with a pressure of about 5 pounds per square inch. As there is no atmosphere on the Moon, then one would expect the spacesuits to look at least a little inflated, much like the Michelin Man, which, as an aside, is one of the world's oldest trademarks belonging to the Michelin Tire Company. The skeptics are at pains to point out that in none of the Apollo videos did the spacesuits look as though they were inflated. For example, take this offering from Mr. Sandpit123, which shows what happens when a balloon is inflated in a vacuum. One expects the spacesuit to inflate like a ball, but the skeptics complain that they never see this in the NASA photographs on the Moon. Finally, on the spacesuits being pressurized, we have this offering from Jera White. Jera shows this photograph of the astronauts that display no sign of being inflated on the Apollo photographs, whereas the spacesuits shown on the EVAs of the shuttle show clear signs of being inflated. In all of the Apollo Moon videos, it is difficult to see any signs of inflation. NASA state that the spacesuit's inner retaining layer takes the pressure, and thus the outer layer of the spacesuit shows little sign of inflation.